Hi, my name is James Siderius, and I'm going to present joint work with Mohammed Mosadir on the folly of breaking echo chambers, which will look at platform interventions and community-based social media. So when you think about community-based social media, one of the common sort of notions is thinking about pages on Facebook that people might like based on interest. So for example, the Boston Red Sox or Marvel Studios. There can also be sort of community-based social media on advice that you see on Reddit. So example, Life Pro Tips, which is like a life advice community, as well as Personal Finance, which is suggestions for how to better manage finances in the household. But also on Twitter, where you think about hashtags and communities formed based on hashtags, such as people that are interested in Ethereum, which is a open source platform for cryptocurrency, as well as academic chatter, where people share and post academic papers of interest. And sort of while these communities are very innocuous, there are other communities that are maybe not so much. For example, our No New Normal, which is based on sort of rejecting COVID policies, or for example, Are the Donald, which is based on sort of these alt-right ideas and very extremist principles. And so what we're going to look at here is sort of a model of community formation, keeping in mind sort of these examples of perhaps both innocuous type communities, as well as those that are sort of more on the extreme end. And what we're going to look at is sort of agents that arrive sequentially and decide when to join certain communities. So we suppose that an agent is going to be born with some multidimensional belief. This is going to be some vector, and this is going to be drawn with some distribution that has density H. So people may be clustered to certain beliefs, or maybe certain regions of the belief space might be very sparse. And you can sort of think of this as interest in politics, whether you're a left-leaning or right-leaning person, whether you're into movies, entertainment, music, whether you have a passion for hiking the Pacific Northwest or not. And so sort of this density H is going to capture the sort of distribution of passions. And the idea is there are going to be M communities, and each of these communities are going to represent some sort of belief, and the agent is going to choose a single community to join where sort of the average belief in that community is closest to their current belief. And so what we assume is that each community J is going to have an average belief, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's sort of weighted proportionally to the number of people in that community and what their beliefs are when they join. And then when some agent joins, of course, this is going to their belief when they enter the community is going to sort of move the belief of the page in a certain direction that's proportional to the number of people that are already in that community and what their belief is when they enter. And again, this is sort of a stylistic model. So, here we assume that the number of communities is fixed. We are able to also handle the case where the number of communities is sort of dynamic and people can choose to form their own community, form a new page and new subreddit, as well as also this sort of example where you might be able to join several different communities instead of just one. So just sort of an illustration of how this might work. So there's some agent that joins, there's already 4 communities that exist on this social media site. They look and they see that, okay, so actually the red community is the one that's sort of most closely aligned with their belief. So they might choose to join this. And when they join this, they actually influence sort of the average belief of the page. So they actually might move the page closer to sort of their pink belief instead of just red. But again, this is sort of proportional to the number of people that already exist on the page, as well as the person that just joined. A new person enters, they have sort of different interests from whoever entered before them. This person is going to join this community, and the belief stays roughly the same. So while agents kind of in that population have very similar beliefs, they don't tend to have identical beliefs. And similarly, agents keep arriving, and these agents sort of decide how to sort of self-segregate themselves into the communities that are sort of mostly that are most closely aligned with their own belief. And so what comes out of this is like a very sort of unique community structure. So as agents sort of decide, where to, how to join pages, what you get is this Voronoi diagram that is determined entirely by sort of the density of the beliefs that I showed before. So it turns out that one of the results we have is that this Voronoi diagram is going to be unique, and it's going to represent sort of the average belief of people on the page. And people are going to sort of segregate themselves into communities based on what their beliefs are entering that stage. And so these dots here in the Voronoi diagram sort of represent the average belief of the community. So what is, the pink or the blue community look like, and the average sort of sentiment of what's on the page. And then the actual shaded region represents the beliefs of agents who join the community. So these are when the agents are sort of entering, they're deciding, okay, do I join the pink community or maybe the blue community? And the community they actually join is determined by sort of these shaded regions in the Voronoi diagram. And what these sort of bold sort of dividers of the Voronoi diagram represent are people that are sort of indifferent between the adjacent community. And so you can sort of construct these by figuring out who is sort of where is the dividing line between someone who is willing to join the pink community or the blue community, and this kind of generates the general structure. In 2 dimensions, these will be lines. In 3 dimensions, these are surfaces that dictate who joins what. And then of sort of most important concern is the sort of fringe communities, right? So as I said before, there are a lot of innocuous communities based on maybe sports interest or entertainment interest. But when it comes to things like politics or other extreme ideas that lead to possibly undesirable actions, we need to think about these communities that live on sort of the edge of society. And what's sort of interesting is that these communities on social media, because they self-segregate into these extreme beliefs, they will tend to sort of echo each other and continue to promote things that might be undesirable. So we're sort of interested in these particular types of communities. And the reason we are is that, social media recently has been, gets kind of a bad rap because the idea of these echo chambers existing has sort of led people to become more polarized, more sort of extreme in their beliefs. And while most models attribute that to maybe algorithmic filtering or sort of trying to push people, away from each other, in reality, a lot of it is driven by this sort of self-segregation. So exactly how I described in the model, where people tend to sort of intentionally choose communities where their belief is welcome and encouraged. And the problem with this, of course, is that with polarization, you get a lot of action based on it that is sort of extreme and can be sort of societally harmful. So, for example, if you think about actions on the left, when we had the defund the police movement and a lot of the Portland riots, this caused a lot of damage and was based on a lot of misinformation about police brutality. Some of it true, but a lot of it was sort of accentuated based on the communities that these people were in. And similarly, on the right side, we had the Capitol riot. We had, storming the Capitol from people on the right side. They were trying to, they believed the election was stolen by Trump or by Biden, and that was very harmful. So when we think about sort of, the platform as someone, maybe that's trying to maximize engagement, but also, they want to have like socially responsible social media. They want to have social media where people are able to exchange beliefs, but there's widespread concerns about, the spread of misinformation, especially within echo chambers. So what is something that the platform can do to sort of mitigate these effects? And one of the interventions that's been proposed is sort of this soft intervention, which is called a quarantine on a given community. And so what a quarantine is, basically is just an extra hurdle that people have to go through before they're able to see content or post content on a certain subreddit. So in this case, you have to actually log in and then you go through this sort of screener question before you can post. And while it doesn't prohibit you from sort of engaging with that community, perhaps, you never learn about the community because you surf the main page, or, perhaps it never comes to your attention just because it's quarantined. So you're more likely to join a different community. But if you're very, very determined, then of course, you're still able to post and sort of engage with those types of people. Then, of course, there's the very hard intervention. And the hard intervention here is a complete ban on the extreme community. So what you might see here is that, okay, even the most determined people are not allowed to interact at all in this community because we've determined that it's, violates certain rules. And as the platform, we completely disallow any posting or engagement with it. And in this case, the person is sort of, even if they're very, they would love to join this subreddit, they're forced to join this other community. And so let's think about sort of what the impacts or the effectiveness of these interventions is. So if we ban a community, we have some extreme community and we decide to ban it, then people that would have joined that community, right, instead of, they still exist, they're still want to be engaged with the platform. They're now forced to join a more moderate society or more moderate sort of subreddit. So in doing so, you get a much larger page and this emergence of basically a new community that includes, moderates that are leaning somewhat close to the extreme community, but not as much. And as a result, what you end up with is a sentiment of the page that is relatively okay. And so by essentially banning this extreme group, you create a community that is, yes, it's very, it leans very hard in one direction, but it's much more innocuous than what it was before. And so in general, this type of intervention can be good. And this is the classic sort of intuition, is that by banning this, you create a community that's a little bit more well-rounded. And, this was done with 4chan when there was a lot of upheaval related to, white supremacy riots that were kind of that started based on the politically incorrect channel on 4chan. And when 4chan decided to ban this, the intervention actually, led to a lot less sort of aggression as a result. Now let's consider, though, the fact that there might be some more subtlety to this problem, right? So think about the fact that there might be a very small fringe community, and this community is a echo chamber that talks about very extreme ideas, and sort of a naive, platform that is trying to make extremism lower decides to ban this community altogether. Well, what happens actually here is that, yes, the sort of extremist page disappears, but these extremists sort of migrate to an adjacent page that pulls a lot of a broader community closer to where their belief is. So what you get in essence is you get the emergence of this larger new community that happens to have a belief that's very much more aligned with the extremists. And in this case, you can imagine the intervention is actually negative, right? By sort of isolating the extremists and letting them talk amongst themselves, they take a certain action that they might have taken anyway, right? They might, they choose not to get vaccinated, but they would have done that regardless. But by sort of integrating that through the act of banning the page, it actually makes these sort of extremist ideas more popular and more mainstream. So by breaking the echo chamber, you essentially broaden the community and infect this community with these extremist ideas. And the policy might actually be that you're better off isolating the extremists through either, a more mild policy like quarantining, or by not doing anything at all and letting them exist in an echo chamber that doesn't then sort of populate to the more mainstream users of the social media site. So when we think about optimal interventions, sort of what is the way we think about it? Well, we think about sort of the fringe of society, the people that are, in these communities that are sort of at the boundaries of, our Voronoi diagram, as being the ones most likely to take sort of, actions that have negative impacts on society. So formally, what does that mean? Well, we think about sort of these hyperplanes that will cut the community structure into what we call, these fringes, depending on sort of, maybe entertainment, it's fine to have a strong opinion, but when you think about politics, not as much. It'll sort of cut this into what we consider reasonable and unreasonable beliefs in terms of the actions that they will take in society. So we can sort of cut this community into, okay, if your belief lies somewhere kind of in this middle region, then you have sort of acceptable beliefs, and like the likelihood that you are to take negative actions is low, or negative impact actions is low. Whereas when you're on the fringe, it's much more dangerous. And what we find is that through, through a somewhat involved algorithm is that we're able to compute these optimal interventions. So what community should you quarantine? Which one should you ban? When should you take no action at all? And it's a difficult problem because, sort of with the two forces I just identified, where we have one force that sort of pushes in the direction of, intervening and trying to moderate communities, the other effect of also kind of quarantining echo chambers that are very, very toxic, means that the intervention policy is very subtle and very rich. And in particular, as we sort of shrink and expand the acceptable region, the intensity of the intervention, so whether you should do nothing, do a weak intervention, or do a strong one, is non-monotone. And so this policy is actually very, very involved. And when policymakers think about, enacting these, they need to be very careful about how they do so. And, up until now, we've thought about these short run interventions where, you're trying to essentially, you find an echo chamber that you think is toxic and you want to moderate it. So you might, ban it. This might be, effective, for instance, like in the run up to an election, or maybe there was a catastrophic event where you want to moderate beliefs in a short amount of time. And this is, we have an algorithm that's able to determine how you should do that. But in the long run, things are very different, right? So instead of just sort of or treating the symptoms, right, trying to eliminate extremist groups in the short run, maybe you want to set up a social media platform that is very stable and the communities are sort of inherently going to be moderate. And this is sort of, curing the disease instead of just treating it in the short run, with this one extremist page or this one extremist subreddit. And so when we think about the long run analysis, it gets also more complicated. And in fact, what we can see is that sometimes policies that work super well or interventions that work super well in the short run will actually backfire or do worse in the long run, and vice versa. And the reason is that, when you think about these short run interventions, you're really looking at local properties of the Voronoi diagram. You're looking at how you could combine communities in a way to either, to limit it, echo chambers without, sort of pulling people in and infecting them with extreme ideas. But when you look at the long run analysis, the Voronoi diagram sort of reestablishes an entire equilibrium. So it sort of changes its entire structure, and the policy becomes a lot more subtle. And so what we did is sort of to demonstrate these ideas is thinking about how banning pages might have changed the sentiment of other communities on Reddit. So for example, Are the Donald was founded on June 27, 2015. It was quarantined on June 26, 2019, so roughly 4 years later. And then it was banned about a year after that. So this provides sort of a rich structure for looking at how, similarly related communities might have changed their sentiment. And this was a very large community. This had 725,000 followers. So it was, there was serious impact. And data also showed that these, while there was other social media sites that sort of became popular after that, such as Trump's new social media site and Parler, that a lot of these subscribers actually remained on Reddit, but just went to different subreddits. And so the central questions that we're sort of interested in looking at is, if we use supervised learning, can we accurately predict sort of the sentiment of Reddit subreddits? So can we train a model that will be very good at predicting out of sample whether a certain post came from a certain subreddit? And the second question we looked at is, how do sort of related communities change, or how does the sentiment of those communities change when there is a policy that quarantines or bans other subreddits? And finally, sort of as a baseline, looking at how the sentiment of communities that are not directly related to that subreddit change as sort of a control group. So how do we do this? Again, I'll mention that it's just preliminary and ongoing work, but this is sort of the methodology that we're thinking about, is that we take 4 subreddits. So Our Politics, which happens to be sort of left-leaning, but Are the Donald, which is kind of an alt-right subreddit, and then Are Conservative, and as well as just the Reddit homepage. And we combine these and we take all the posts and we train a natural language processing neural net to sort of make a prediction about which of the 4 subreddits the post came from. And we train this data on just the pre-quarantine, so before June 26, 2019. And the main takeaway here is just that, we have a fairly good predictability rate for the different subreddits. However, what we find is that once the policy goes into effect, once Reddit decides to quarantine R the Donald and not, make it harder for users to actually post there, we find that there's more extremism related to R conservative. So basically, the misclassification rate of posts that are on R conservative actually end up misclassifying it as R the Donald. So they believe that the sentiment of that page is actually closer to R the Donald than it was in the pre-quarantine period. And we don't see these effects when we're looking at the front page in R politics. So to sort of sum up, the classic argument against platform interventions is that essentially there is a violation of free speech, and this has to be balanced against things like misinformation and hate speech that generally reduce the welfare of people. And the other classic argument is that, because of the fact that people can self-segregate into these communities, there's this echo chamber effect that sort of contributes to increasing polarization. So a policymaker that's trying to decide between whether, interact or enacting a platform intervention or not must decide whether, which of these effects wins. But what we show actually is that the naive platform interventions that are trying to sort of accomplish the second effect of reducing echo chambers might actually exacerbate extremism. It might lead to the spread of fringe beliefs and sort of infecting the larger population with bad ideas. And what's sort of interesting is that we find in several cases that there are these interventions that perhaps should be very soft or not exist at all. Just because if you go in with a hard intervention, again, you might, while you're breaking the echo chamber, you can actually create sort of this negative effect that spreads misinformation. It's still preliminary, but the evidence that we found shows that R conservative actually becomes more extreme following the quarantine. And so by removing R the Donald, you essentially infect like more moderate groups with these sort of alt-right or more extreme ideas. And so these two effects need to be considered carefully, and interventions need to be well designed. Thank you very much.